What is up, health enthusiasts? It's Coach Lamby here with Working Weights LLC, your guide to strength, health, and all things nutrition. Joined as always by my co-host Dwayne Ulrich, aka Poppy Dwarrell.
What's happening, guys?
And today we are going over the 2011 FDA committee meeting on artificial food coloring. All right, Dwayne. So you were talking before we started rolling. I cut you off.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So, Coach Lamby and I had decided that we were going to look at these documents from different sides, and I'm looking at the whole process with the FDA from the side of the CSPI, which is the Center for Science in the Public Interest. And the document that I was looking at and trying to dive into and develop a feeling for their side of the issue, and we'll get into the issue in a minute, but I thought it was just going to be mostly studies and data and so forth and so on. And really, that document alone was mostly a legal document about, it really didn't have that much to do with the actual studies and the data that's been collected over the past years concerning synthetic food dyes in foods. Instead, it was a serious look at the FDA's responsibility in providing safety for consumers of foods and outlining things that, well, first of all, it took a deep dive off into the definitions of safety. And also there's this congressional bill in the United States that in regards to the FDA and their responsibility to providing a safety net for consumers. So yeah, it was really interesting. So it was, I don't want to say it was overwhelming, but it was difficult. But I definitely I feel like I have my side of the conversation as Coach Lamby and I are going to present it. So it's going to be a good show today.
All right. Yeah. So just to inform everybody, so as we were doing all this research on the food coloring and stuff for the previous two episodes, I kept coming up to the FDA 2011 committee hearing that they had on that the CSPI brought. So they petitioned the FDA specifically to reevaluate the evidence and look at this position on artificial food coloring again, because they had one prior to that. I want to say like maybe in the 1980s or something like that.
Right.
And so they petitioned them again. They had this committee meeting, and then I ended up finding the actual transcript for that committee meeting, and I started reading it, and it was I found it to be really, really interesting. So you have this whole panel, which was the FAC or FCA Food Commission Authority, I think. Yeah. So Food Commission Authority or Food Authority Commission. I don't know. But anyway, it's a panel of a bunch of different scientists. They all had different specialties. Some of them were toxicologists. Some of them were biologists. Some of them were specifically dealing with neurology and stuff. So had all these people on this committee. You had representatives from the FDA who presented their side. You had representatives from the CSPI, and then there was a representative from the food color industry itself. So, I thought it was fascinating stuff. And then I found the document that I sent to you, which I did not read specifically because I felt like this would make a good conversation, a good topic for this episode.
Oh yeah, it's going to make a good conversation for sure.
Yeah, so I read kind of like the first paragraph of it, and to my understanding, the document that you read that we're going to go over today is in response to the 2011 committee hearing.
Yes.
And so we're kind of going to give two sides of this. So I have not read what Dwayne has read, and Dwayne has not read what I have. And let me just say this. So I found what I thought was the entire transcript. And I started reading it and I got to the end of it and it was like, we're going to convene again tomorrow at 8 a.m. And I was like, oh my Lord. So I ended up reading almost 700 pages
Oh my
of
gosh.
this stuff. Yeah. So hopefully I will be able to remember everything everybody said, but
I was
really,
struggling
really,
with
yeah, really interesting discussion within this committee hearing. And
I
I learned several things. I'm sure we're going to get into it. So yeah, go ahead.
I thought I had it bad with 33 to 66, pages. I'm going, oh my gosh, 700, dude. And
Seven.
bro, and I didn't just start last night. I just want everybody to know that. And before we get too deep into this, I just want to give a shout out to Manna, the coffee shop and bakery here in Tomball, Texas, for letting me set up out here on the patio and broadcast from here. Internet's down back at Camp Ulrich, so um, there you go.
Cool. So I do have one update before we get into this. I actually have two, but I think we're going to probably discuss the other one. So the paper by Locke et al., the one that we did not have access to, that was only an
Right,
abstract.
right.
So I did receive the full paper from the authors. So I requested it from them, and I did receive it, and I went through it. Um, and so I updated the let me share my screen here. I updated the mind map, and so we'll just cover this really, really quickly here. So this was in Chinese participants in China, and they had the three capsules. So capsule A had only artificial colors, capsule B had only the sodium benzoate, the preservative, and then capsule C was a placebo, and that placebo was lactose.
Hmm.
And so the capsule containing the artificial food coloring is actually the same mix B, that was in the McCann study. Um, Let me get down to the results here. And so what they found here, so they have this SWAN, that's the acronym for whatever hyperactivity scores they had, but they had them separated by parent and teacher. And so as we can see here, so in red was an increase in hyperactivity, blue was kind of no change, and green would be a decrease. And so for the placebo, we see, according to parents, the placebo caused a rise in hyperactivity more than did capsule B. Capsule B was the sodium benzoate. Capsule A, interestingly, is the artificial food coloring, which for the whole sample, all 103 people, there was a small, not all of these are non-statistically significant, but there was a
Hmm.
small reduction in hyperactivity score there. So you can see that's negative. And then the per protocol analysis is just like the other ones. So kids who ended up drinking 85% or more, or took their pills 85% or more, and they received full reports back from both parents and teachers or whatever. So we see all three here. There's reductions for the parents, so there were reductions from baseline. Um, in hyperactivity. And then for the teachers, under the placebo, we see a pretty significant increase for the whole sample, and same thing for the per protocol. So the kids who consumed all of, most of their pills, and the parents who reported back and everything. So for placebo, on both of these, both parent and teachers, these scores were higher than was it for the artificial food coloring or the preservative. Um, and so something interesting I found about that in this FDA committee hearing, and maybe we'll get into it, but I'll bring it up. But the OEHHA assessment said that these results were hard to interpret because they were compared to baseline, blah, blah, blah. Well, they actually provided right here the instructions on how to interpret these results. And so if subtracting the baseline score from the score in a challenge period would mean a negative value, then it indicates less problematic behavior. So all these negative values indicate less problematic behavior. And this suggests that the removal of the additives from the diet had reduced the level of problematic behavior. but that the reintroduction of the additive has not brought the behavior back to baseline. Um, so they have it separated parent and teacher up here, and then they have them combined. They have two different kind of scores here, and we can see here that there was massive reductions for most of it, except the placebo. The placebo increased so
that's all over the map, and most of that is just like really, it's like you said, statistically not significant. Yeah, I had to mute my mic because a
yeah.
fire truck was going by.
Yeah,
My bad.
so that's another study where we see reductions in the behavior. So except for the placebo, which contained lactose, actually increased the behavior there, and that's interesting. And so that kind of leads, so specifically dealing with that population, the Chinese children there, that leads me to believe that there was possibly something else in the background diet that may have been causing the higher baseline score rather than the food coloring. Because when they reintroduced the food colorings, it didn't seem to bring the scores back up to baseline, which we
Right.
were seeing in the other trials.
Right.
So interesting stuff there. All right, Dwayne, you want to give us a go with what you found, and then maybe if there were like main questions that they had or specific issues that they had with the 2011 FDA hearing, and then maybe I can answer some of those based on what I read.
Okay, so they do have issues with the hearing. I'm looking at my notes as I look away, people. So just bear with me. I did coalesce or collate the questions that they had from the hearing, and also I put in a few more things about because they cited the common thing that we hear is that people cite of the many studies of the
Yeah,
many studies
there's a
of the
ton.
many studies. Yeah, and yeah, there's a lot of studies out there, but what happens more often than not is that, in my opinion, is that they don't really name the studies. They're just, oh, like, oh, there's so many studies that say this, and this.
Mm.
And so I was able to pull some so the document that I read also had a link to an original, the first draft letter from the doctors that were involved in this, as well as the CSPI. And so I was able to go to that link and kind of coalesce what they were looking at, what their issues were. I
Mhm.
have that, and I have it kind of in an order, so probably won't get down into the their final words toward until the end of this.
Mhm.
So, for example, just I'll be real quick with it. So I have my study here. What I looked at is they have a preliminary statement that I want to work with, action requested. Then also there's studies that they looked at, calls for eliminating the use of food dyes, the food industry. They make a case that the food industry can eliminate food dyes without a significant financial impact to them, as well as and again, the document that I studied the most, the FDA has ample legal authority to ban the use of dyes,
Mhm.
and if not just the authority, but the duty
Well, okay.
if it's found to be um,
Yeah.
unsafe.
Yeah.
Unsafe. So I've broken my stuff up into questions, like we had talked about, to identify the questions that they had and that they brought up. Um, and
Mhm.
that's how I'm prepared to go forward, is just
Yeah.
with these questions, and then we can go from that.
Yeah. Let's do it.
All right. So the first question that came out of there is, and this is kind of typical about some of the things that they wrote in their initial letter back in 2001, as well as in the follow-up document that we were just talking about. So with around 3 to 10% of school-age children in the United States suffering from hyperactivity, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and or related behavioral problems, isn't that a significant enough number of children to take these dyes off of the market, at least temporarily, While new studies are conducted, parents trust the FDA to protect innocent children from harmful chemicals in their foods. Why won't they do something about it? If the FDA refuses to pursue this, are they not complicit in endangering children? So I know that's three questions in one, but it just starts with 3 to 10% of school-age children being affected.
No.
Why don't we do something?
Okay. That's so that brings up an interesting thing for me. So they're saying the rate of ADHD diagnoses is between 3 and 10%.
Yes.
Um, so I know that these numbers were brought up in the committee hearing meetings. Now I do have these pulled up for everybody. Let me see if I can.
I'm just going to say I can almost answer that question myself. It was hard to stay on one side of the fence or the other because I'm going,
Yeah.
hmm.
So I have both of these here. This is day one and this one's day two. And there's just like, like look at this thing. Both of these are 300 and some odd pages long.
Oh my gosh,
Ooh,
that's a
this
transcript.
this one doesn't even have my oh well, I'll have to look over to the other one. So I may be able to remember where stuff is, but I know that these numbers were brought up during the hearing. And then certainly regarding the meta-analysis that we looked at, Nig et al.,
Yeah.
is that so 10%, let's call the top end for easy math, right? 10% of children are diagnosed with ADHD. However, not all 10% of those children diagnosed with ADHD are affected by artificial food coloring. It's only 10% of children with ADHD. So it's 10% of 10% of children.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is that? What would that be? 1% of
1%.
the 1% of the population of children? Yeah.
Yes.
So
But they
let's
pad their
do
question.
something.
But while you're looking for that, they pad their question here. So basically, they're saying how many children have to be affected to like do something?
Mm,
At least conduct more studies.
yeah.
And we're going to find later on that another thing they ask for is, um, hey, just put a warning label.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a whole bunch of talk about the warning label.
Right.
So let me look this up here. What percent of the US population is allergic to peanuts? Um, yeah, okay. So the prevalence of peanut allergies is 1 to 2% of the US population, which would be just about equivalent to the percent of children who based on what we saw would be have an adverse reaction to food colorings. And so, I don't see anyone calling for a ban on the peanuts.
Right.
The
Right. Right.
percentage of people who are affected and the type of reaction that you would get from a peanut allergy is far more severe. You know what I mean? Like you're talking
Absolutely.
hospitalization and death. Um, so, I don't think that they make a very good case there.
Well, I agree with you on that. However, just from their side, I'm not giving up my question or argument right here, but on the other side of that same thing is that you do see um, warnings about peanuts, like on menus or like
Right.
even school lunch programs. If there's a peanut or a nut a component to a food, then
Hmm.
usually there's a warning about that.
It says
So
may contain
may contain,
or
absolutely.
does contain.
Right. And so what the actual verbiage is later down the line, I think that a large portion of the people involved in this would be happy with any warning. Of course, they want to say that it does, and it does cause, and it does cause. But
Yeah,
I
that's the
also got
other Yeah, that's the other thing. Everything that we looked at, every bit of scientific literature that we looked at definitely held the position that there was not a causal inference being made.
right, right, right. I agree with that. Um, yeah, I agree with that. At least, yeah. So I do have some reports here that they cite. I'm not going to go into them just yet, but they cite that. Oh, this shows that it's that. Hey, this shows it. That shows it causes it. hey,
Mm,
there's causal effect here. And it's like, but they generalize that. And if they look at the actual data, which we did, we took the deep dive twice, that that doesn't really cover that. So
hmm.
you ready for my next question?
Yeah, yeah.
This may not be something you can really readily answer, but the CSPI asks why the FDA continues to leave these sections of disinformation on their website in the light of many studies which provide evidence that a diet can affect behavior. In other words, they said they want to keep things on there. There's no hard evidence that shows that these dyes are connected with hyperactivity, et cetera, et cetera. But why would they leave that on there when at least they can show that diets have a causal effect on the behavior? So there was a guy, while you're thinking about that, there was a guy way back in his name in the early 70s, Dr. Ben Feingold. I
Yep.
think you probably heard of him. So his whole thing was he developed a diet that just removed a lot of those food coloring type foods. And it wasn't just food coloring type foods, but his diet expanded on a few things there as well. And so there's a pretty consistent belief amongst the CSPI and these doctors that authored this letter that the diet can make a difference in a kid's behavior. So
Yeah, I did find that Feingold diet book. And so the Feingold diet, and then there were also several studies. Those were brought up in the OEHHA assessment. They were also brought up in possibly Nig et al. Or the other review that we looked at, the one that brought up the nutrition, the specific nutrient deficiencies. And then it was brought up several times by the representatives from CSPI during the FDA committee hearing.
yeah,
And so the main evaluation from the diet is that there were studies done on using the Feingold diet, the elimination diet. And there's also still currently going is the Feingold Association, where if people are interested in putting their children on this diet, eliminating additives from their child's diet, blah blah blah, they'll help you out with that, and they have specific recommendations that they make and all this stuff. But
mhm,
the main consensus statement regarding the elimination diets, and this was even in Nig et al., is that they don't really seem to work very well for the large majority of people who try them. Um, and yes, and so there's issues with blinding during these trials. So just like we brought up um, at the studies that we looked at, like you're not exactly blinding people to the fact that they're completely changing their diet, right?
right. I agree with that.
Yeah. Oh, and
Uh,
one of the questions I think um, that the panel had to address was regarding whether or not elimination diets should be, I forget the wording that they call it, but like this, a blanket recommendation that
right,
doctors make. And so, the panel came to the decision like, no, this shouldn't be because there just isn't enough proven efficacy with the elimination diet. So to say, no, this shouldn't be the main recommendation made. However, they did make it very clear, like if people are interested in doing it, that it certainly is an option, right?
right. Absolutely. I got that. Yeah, it is an option. Um, so my next question basically comes from some of the reports that CSPI and the initial the first draft letter, which actually went out to the FDA, came up with certain uh, studies. I have the studies in my document. I don't think it's worth reading all the way through it, but
Yeah, no.
I do want to just cut a couple of things. So one study was done by in 82, behavioral toxicologist Bernard Weiss concluded that in his study, it is very common to the rest of what everybody else did, blind study, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is interesting because they included this the CSPI included this as part of their documentation, that he concluded that the total evidence, although not wholly consistent, nevertheless suggests that the Feingold hypothesis is in principle correct, but he has no data to show that. I just answered my own question.
So,
why,
so it was Dr.
why would you use that?
Weiss. Dr.
Dr.
Weiss
Weiss,
said that the data was inconsistent.
data was inconsistent as far
Okay,
as the diet.
so Dr. Weiss was a presenter during the committee hearing, and he did talk about his study that he was involved in. And he actually said that he felt that the results over the entire body were consistent. So we have two different positions from Dr. Weiss, and not that you're not
I
allowed to
know.
change your mind. Oh, these balloons again.
I
So,
saw it.
okay. So regarding Dr. Weiss's study, some of the members of the FAC panel brought up these issues and saying, so Dr. Weiss specifically selected children on the basis that they were responsive to dietary changes. Okay. So when he started his trial, he was doing basic recruitment, and it was what is called open label, which means people aren't blinded to the fact that you're giving them some treatment or they're being assessed on this basis, right? There's no blinding, it's open. And during that process, there was pre-selecting of these children on the basis that they were responders to the change in diet. And then once they put them in the trial and they were blinded, I think there was maybe like 20 children or something. It was a very, very small number. And the number of children who actually responded to food collars was 2, and only one of the 2 was a significant response. And so they brought up those questions to and say, well, listen, if this was the problem that you're saying it is, why, on a sample of children who would have extreme selection bias, there's extreme selection bias in this particular sample, you're not getting the response, right? Why is it not 18 children responded instead of 2? Why didn't you have, 12 hyper responders instead of 1? And I don't feel he had very good answers to those questions.
No, I don't think he did either, in all honesty. And again, I'm betraying my side, but a detail, first of all, in regards to Weiss, the children's teachers observed that clearly significant reductions in hyperactive behavior related to diet, approximately 3 to 8 of the children. That's statistically insignificant. And then a detailed reanalysis by Weiss found that 1 child responded sharply and consistently. 1.
Yep, that's exactly it. So there was no mention of 3 to 8 during the hearing. So
yeah,
this is getting interesting.
The whole study had 26 kids to talk. That was a
yeah.
selection.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. 26 kids, and during the committee hearing, so I
want to,
find he danced around this question man, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 times. The question had to be asked to him 4 or 5 times, and it actually came from 2 or 3 different committee members. So there's one committee member, I believe her name was Dr. Voorhees, and I believe it's a her.
Yeah.
Asked him this question, why are you only getting 1 big responder? And he danced around the question, and she had to ask him 2 or 3 times. And then another committee member chimed in and said, well, listen, I think I have a better way of answering, because I have kind of the same question. And so that person answered, and he danced around that question as well. And then another person had to ask, you know what I mean? And I don't think that there ever was a really good response to that question from him.
Yeah.
And so now we're kind of seeing that when they're on the public record, we're getting one type of response, and when it's coming from the CSPI and they can put whatever they want to put in there, we're getting a different response.
Yeah, absolutely. I have another one here, and it's a question that's in regards to there were 2 studies done by Connors. I don't know if you remember that, but so in Connors 2, I just call the second study Connors 2, the author concluded these data points firmly establish that artificial colors may be particularly disruptive to younger children, and that it will be important to examine the possible mechanisms whereby these chemicals act on the CNS, central nervous system. With such evidence, why would not the FDA choose to act with either further study or at least a warning label on foods? So there's the question, but I answered it. It answers itself, honestly. I don't mean to steal your thunder, but he said they may be disruptive to younger children, and that maybe you should be looking at this. That's really what he says. That's really what his study says.
Yeah. So the issue with the Connors studies, if I can remember correctly, because they did talk about, I think it was one of the FDA representatives brought up the limitations. Maybe it was one of the committee members. The committee members did a fantastic job of questioning both sides of this thing. So I was really impressed with them.
Right.
But the limitations with Connors is that the behaviors that they were reporting on really did not have anything to do with ADHD and hyperactivity. It was more like irritability and a few other like some general non-specific kind of symptoms that could really be associated with any kind of so food intolerance specific, just any food intolerance or anything. It was just kind of non-specific. And then they
Right.
also didn't have the number of participants in the study wasn't powered enough to be able to have confidence, to the results that were produced.
13 children.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's not enough. That's not a big enough sample.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about that all the time.
And yeah, talking about sample size as we go on here, is that one thing that kept creeping up during this meeting is that as the sample size increases, the the effect size decreases. And so, when we talk about banning this on the basis of the whole population, so if we have, so the studies that we looked at, specifically McCann et al., which was in Southampton, and they had the 3-year-olds and the 8 and 9-year-olds, that's kind of like the largest sample size that there was. And when you look at that, that's the biggest one, and they kind of had the smallest effect size out of all of it, especially when you took in account the whole sample size and not just the ones who did the 85%, consumed 85% of their drink. So the whole sample was lower than all of the estimate or all of the effect sizes previously than that. So when we start increasing the sample size, that effect size is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And then when we extrapolate that to a whole population, we're looking at something that may not produce any effect.
Right. Southampton, that was the one in the UK, right?
Yeah, well, there are two of them in the UK.
Okay, so the British Food Standards Agencies, that's the one. I'm gonna have something to say about that one.
Mm-hmm.
You ready to move on?
Yeah.
So in a study sponsored by the FDA, 2 subjects, let me give you the sample size. 22 children were the sample size over 77 days. Two subjects showed clear reactions according to their parents. A 34-month-old girl reacted dramatically on the days she received the dyes. A 3-year-old boy displayed convincing evidence of sensitivity to color challenge for behaviors his mother considered typical of his outbursts. These data points further strengthen the accumulating evidence from controlled trials supplemented by laboratory experiments that modest doses of synthetic colors and perhaps other agents excluded by elimination diets can provoke disturbed behavior in children. And then CSPI's question is, why not take protective action? By the way, I think we just answered that question. So,
yeah,
a 34-month-old girl, a 3-year-old boy, that's it. Uh,
Yeah, so it was only 2 out of 20 something,
22.
22 children. Um,
I
yeah.
that says
Uh,
it all, really. That says it all.
yeah.
God, I
A
hate to
lot of
be answering
these,
my own questions, man. Ugh.
yeah, a lot of the studies are just are too underpowered, and it was brought up several times by one of the guys, maybe it was Dr. Gray. He was on the committee. And so on the second day, as they're trying to answer these questions, they're having these big long discussions on what some of these words mean within the questions that are being asked, blah blah blah. And he kept saying over and over and over, like, and I kind of have to agree with him at this point, is that the data that we have so far on this specific topic is an embarrassment because of the way that the studies are done, the sample sizes, what outcomes these things are specifically addressing. And this was a major concern for a lot of people on the panel, was that it's hard to come up with a consensus statement because most of these studies are so different in the way that they're administering the tests, the way that they're doing blinding, whether or not they validated the blinding, the outcomes that they are looking to assess. Some of them are dealing with hyperactivity and inattention, and others are not. And so there's so much variation. And the representative from the colors, the food color industry, he brought up a good point because one of the committee members asked him, like, are there any studies that you are currently doing? So if you're aware that we have these problems, are there any studies that you're currently doing? And he said, no, not at this point, because so to make a strong statement, the way the FDA evaluates synthetic food colors in the United States has basically become the worldwide template by which everyone is assessing food additives. And so this gentleman, this representative of the food industry, said that they not only produce food colors for the United States and do the testing and all stuff, but they also do it for Europe and Australia and everywhere else as well. So the reason that the industry hasn't really gone through the efforts of doing new tests is because they are looking to hear from all of these different scientific bodies on a basically a standardized way to go about running these tests, because what we have before, it's basically like the wild west of scientific discovery.
It is. It is. It
And so
is.
he's like, we want something that's going to be standardized, that's going to be accepted by everyone to help answer these specific questions. And the alternative hypotheses that we brought up and a lot of the issues that we found within these studies were most of the same questions that were brought up during these 2 days of hearing. And a lot of them were not answered because the studies have not been done with the ability to answer them. Blinding was a huge issue for all of these studies. Um, it's just hard to blind somebody to the fact that you're completely changing their diet. You know what I mean?
Right, right. It's one thing that I kept finding too is that all these studies that I'm talking about, they were all done, they're all done slightly differently. Now, some of them, and we're going to find this in, I think it's Schaub and Trend,
Hmm.
and that they looked at other people's studies. And I think when we were doing our deep dive the other day, it was, I think, was it NIG that looked at several different studies?
Yeah, Nig's meta-analysis.
Yeah, yeah, meta-analysis. So none of these, all of these ones that I'm talking about, each study was done differently. Some used a cookie,
Hmm.
some used this, some
Yeah.
used combinations of colors, some used larger quantities, some used shorter quantities. And I think what the FDA would love to see, or even the color industry, synthetic color industry, is like, okay, well, if we're going to do this, let's do this
Hmm.
way. Here's the standard. This is the
Yes.
template. Let's do this. And so I've been talking to
And
several
and
people.
specific outcomes. What specific
Yes.
outcomes are we looking for here? Yeah.
And you got to figure out some way to make the outcomes empirical. You
Yes.
just got to make them empirical because, oh, that child is just so cute. Oh, look what she did. So funny. That's kid's a tyrant and he's reacting to red dye.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's you've got to figure out a standardized measurement system of what's happening. We should probably move on because I
Yeah.
want
Yeah.
to. I'm going to jump the Schaub and Trent thing, but
Okay.
basically, Schaub and Trent. I'll just say this about them. They published a meta-analysis studies on dyes and behavior. I'm not going to go into which ones they were, but after examining such factors as sample size and a couple of other things, Schaub and Trent concluded that the effect of dyes on children was statistically significant, particularly with regard to parents' ratings.
Yeah.
But again, the studies they looked at were all small sample sizes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Schaub, yeah. So Schaub actually presented at the committee hearing as well,
Did he
and he
really?
spoke about this meta-analysis. Yeah. And so the some of the limitations that deal with that, the thing that people had concerns with, he did that meta-analysis as a student, as a medical student, which
Wow.
in and of itself doesn't really, I don't seem to have any issue with, because that's how a lot of the studies that we have come about. People are going through their PhD, and as a result of that, you have to do studies, basically.
Right.
So that's kind of how we get studies. But the second thing is that when he was going about doing this, there really wasn't any way in kind of like developing inclusion and exclusion criteria for to answer this specific question.
Right. Right.
So a lot of the trials that he looked at and included, and a lot of the ones that he excluded. So there's, his meta-analysis is, there were issues with publication bias because he excluded a lot of the smaller trials. And there are trials that have like 2 children in it or 2 people. He excluded some of those. And then the reporting, so the outcomes, again, what specifically are the outcomes that they're looking at? A lot of those, there's a lot of variation within the studies that he looked at. And so this effect size that he's getting isn't exactly measuring the same outcome.
Yeah. 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 I get it. I get it. Another study that was mentioned here is also subsequent to the Schaub-Trent meta-analysis, the British Food Standards Agency, the FSA, they randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled trials. That was the whole Southampton.
Mm-hmm.
And their results, let me just put here, the first study tested the effects of 20 milligrams of a mixture of 4 dyes, which was used in the United States, and 25 milligrams of sodium benzoate on 277 3-year-old children.
So
Their
that was
results,
Bateman.
Bateman, yes, Bateman.
Yep.
Right, under the FSA, it was Bateman. And we did look at that already, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So parents, but not clinical testing, detected statistically significant benefits during the weeks in which children were not exposed to the chemicals and deterioration during weeks in which the children were exposed. But we looked at that. Oh man, I'm answering your part of the question. We looked at
so
that data.
We looked at that. I have issues with the way that the blinding was done.
Yes.
Right, because we see the they're basically mountain peaks if you were to draw it. So on a washout period, we saw decreases in behavior, and then when they introduced either the placebo or the active ingredient, we saw increases. And so interesting. So there was that genetic study that we looked at on the single nucleotide polymorphisms by Stevenson.
Yeah.
Stevenson, I believe that's right. Stevenson was actually the supervisor on both the McCann study and the Bateman study.
Yes.
So, and then we have Locke et al., and Locke is using mix B from the Bateman study, or excuse me, from the McCann study. And so as I'm reading this and I'm discovering this, I'm like, well, we have one scientist, and based on what he said during the committee hearing, I kind of feel like he has a bias. Yeah, a bias that, and he's looking for a way to do, but it seems like all of those studies that we looked at, so Bateman, McCann, Stevenson, and Locke, those seem to be the most robust studies that we have to date. So what we have evaluated in our previous episodes seems to be the most comprehensive study. This was not in disagreement with anyone at this committee on both sides of the thing. They all agreed. These were mainly the studies that they talked about. They didn't talk very much about earlier studies. They specifically really went into depth on the ones that we looked at.
Right.
So after hearing what he had to say and then discovering that he's involved in all of these different things, and I'm just thinking to myself, they're just performing the same study over and over and over. That's why we're, finding these things. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's one guy out there performing the same study, and not to
Yeah.
say that everything's entirely his fault. So he was specifically tasked by the European Food Safety Authority, the EFSA, um, to look specifically at these specific food colors that he did. So what was in
Right.
mix A and mix B, they was specifically asked of those things. Because there were questions about like, well, why didn't you check these other things? So the ones that they looked at are, I guess they're called azo dyes. So they're in their own
Yes.
specific category, and they
Yes.
didn't look at things like blue and green, which are
Yes.
different categories of colors. And he's
Right.
like, well,
Right.
this is what we were specifically tasked with. And they specifically asked him to add the preservative in there.
Right.
So that's why it was in there.
Right. Right. One of the things that I found here also, in the second study, the second study of the of Bateman, the authors concluded that artificial colors or sodium benzoate preservative or both in the diet result in increased activity in 3-year-old and 8 and 9-year-old children. The implication, this is in the same paragraph, the implications of these results for the regulation of food additive use could be substantial. They don't even really take, he doesn't really even take a stand and say it is substantial. It could be.
Yeah.
And when we were talking both before we just launched off on into this FSA study, I just go back to, gosh, I'm really talking a lot today. I'm go back to the confidence intervals. And
Hmm.
remember on the peaks and on this one where you showed and you drew the
Hmm.
lines across there. It,
Yeah. So this is the other thing that I had the discovery on that I want to talk about. So in the McCann study, they said that they found a statistically significant difference between mix A and placebo or mix B and placebo, depending on 3 or 8 or 9-year-olds, right? And I said, well, the only reason they found that is because they removed the confidence intervals.
right, right,
So during this committee meeting, no one really brought up that issue. And several people said that, yes, we recognize that there is a statistically significant difference. Really, it was only for the kids who consumed 85% or more. Once you included the whole sample size, that those
right.
statistically significant went away. So I had to think, I'm like, well, am I seeing this chart incorrectly if these other people aren't bringing it up? Right. So I had to ask some other people about this. What are they doing here? Is this appropriate? Blah, 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 blah. And so the answer that I got is that you have the left side of the chart, which provided the mean
Yes,
estimates and their confidence intervals. The right side of the chart should have been a separate chart. It's very confusing to put the two together, but the right side
right,
of the chart was the results from a different statistical analysis. It wasn't the same analysis that the left side of the chart was done.
right, right.
And so I asked, okay, well, what is the zero line there? And so the zero line represents, so that right side of the chart is where we see that point estimate for mix A and mix B and the confidence intervals. That represents the difference between A and placebo. And the dashed line, 0, would be placebo against placebo, right?
Yes, yes,
And so I said, well, how is this not removing the confidence intervals? And they said, well, when you do this type of analysis, and this is kind of how we get, like if you look at the red meat studies that we looked at, if we compare the lower quantile to the upper quantile, we get this effect size, right? And that's kind of how they do it. But when you compare placebo against placebo and you get that 0 result, the confidence intervals are 0.
yes,
So like may it be appropriate the way that they performed that statistical analysis? I guess so. But what I'm hearing the explanation for that is like they're removing the confidence of, like, I'm just hearing a rose by a different name.
Yeah.
And the way that they performed that second statistical analysis is not done in any other study looking at these questions. It wasn't done in Bateman. It wasn't done in Locke. The studies in the Niggett all meta-analysis didn't have the statistical analysis. So it seemed to me, and then after finding out that Dr. Stevenson is involved in all these studies, it seemed to me like they didn't find the results they were looking for in the first trial.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then when it
Yeah.
came to the second trial, yeah, I also have to say this. Okay. So
Go
then when
ahead.
it
Go
came
ahead.
to the second trial, and they're involving the 3-year-olds and the 8 and 9-year-olds, we saw for the 3-year-olds that there were actually decreases
Yeah.
in activity compared to baseline, right? For the 8 and 9-year-olds, we saw that there were increases. The only reason that there are increases, now remember, they combined all of the scores. They had 3 different tests that they were applying to the 3-year-olds and the 8 and 9-year-olds. And then the 8 and 9-year-olds got a computer test that they took, right? An objective standardized test. The 3-year-olds didn't get it because they can't sit down and take that test. And they combined all those scores to make a global hyperactive aggregate score, right? So they had reports from parents, they had reports from teachers, and one other type of testing. And so instead of reporting those separately the way that they did in Bateman, where we saw reports from parents and then a report from the psychologist, they combined them together to form one score. And the only reason that the 8 and 9-year-olds we saw an increase is because that computerized test pushed them over the limit. And Stevenson acknowledged during his presentation that the children actually there wasn't an association between the food coloring and the computerized test scores, but there was an association between the length of the study. So as the weeks went on, the computerized test scores got worse and worse and worse, which kind of means that the children got bored and didn't want to take the test. So you had children, week 4, week 5, week 6, who are not finishing the test on time. They're just stopping early. Some of them just are, saying, I'm not going to take that test today. You can't make me take it. And so that's the only reason why those scores are positive in the 8 and 9-year-old. When you looked at he said this in the testimony, not a testimony, he's not on trial, but during his presentation, for the parent scores and the teacher scores, the results were statistically insignificant. There wasn't this bump up. The only thing that pushed the 8 and 9-year-olds up above baseline was that computer score, and that's because the kids hated taking the test and their scores got worse as time went on. Oh man. And then another thing with this study. So I have less and less confidence in this study. They only took reports. So if we remembered in Bateman, they had a week without any drink, and then a week with a drink, and then a week without a drink, and a week with a drink. And then in McCann, they had 6 weeks where they had a drink the whole time, but on the washout periods, they were receiving the placebo drink, right? Which kind of eliminated that whole placebo effect of either receiving or not receiving a drink. However,
right.
The parents did not have to fill out behavior reports on the washout weeks, only on the weeks where they received a challenge.
Well,
right. So it's like if you went to the doctor because, something was hurting, your knee was hurting, and the doctor was like, well, have you noticed any issues in your lower back? And you're like, well, now that you say something, like maybe I am.
Now that you mention it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, if you're not receiving a test on a placebo week, and then
that must be placebo week.
Yeah, the following week, a researcher is calling you and saying, hey, can you fill out your questionnaire this week? Do you think there could be a blinding issue there?
Oh, absolutely. I've got something else for you. I have never, ever thrown this out in a conversation with Coach Lamby, and have never thrown it out in a conversation on any of our podcasts. But it just dawned on me. I just got to put it in here, even though I'm trying to support the other side here. So I have a degree in education. Okay. The difference between the activity and the development of a 3-year-old and the activity and development between 8, 9 year olds. We're talking fourth, fifth, maybe sixth graders, and a 3 year old. You can't combine those. That's like combining the space shuttle with a bicycle and trying to come up with similarities.
Hmm.
It's just it's just not. I don't care if you're an MD or a PhD. Come on, man. Really get over it. Anyway,
Yeah.
moving on. You ready to move on?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to read something real quick here. Um, this is on the Bateman stuff. Based on the results of these two studies, as well as the earlier body of research, the FSA has strongly urged companies to eliminate the use of dyes. FSA Chair Dom Deidre Hutton stated in April of 2008, it's the agency's duty to put consumers first. These additives give color to foods, but nothing else. It would therefore be sensible, in the light of findings of the Southampton study, to remove them from food and drink products. UK industry has already taken great strides to remove these colors from food. This decision builds on the work already done and will encourage industry to continue down this path. The FSA also stated the FSA is recommending to UK ministers that industry takes voluntary action to remove these colors by 2009 and is pressing for action at the European Union level. According to a news account, Dame Hutton added, if one puts consumers first, then the evidence suggests it would be sensible for these colors to be taken out of the food that children eat, and by definition, out of all foods, as you cannot separate the food that adults and children eat. The European Union Environmental Committee voted to ban artificial colors in foods for babies and small children. That measure also included a warning label on children's foods. Also, dyes may provoke allergenic effects and hyperactivity in children. If the European Parliament approves the measure, member governments would have to approve it for the regulations to take effect. With
Okay.
global,
So that's
with
so that's
global,
the
with with global governments taking action, shouldn't the U.S.
so that's the
and then
EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority. Yes.
yes.
Okay. Gosh, I know exactly what the response to this was. And I gotta tell you, like I am finding the credibility of the CSPI to be diminished by the minute. Okay,
Yes.
so somebody, I know I read this and I can't find it right now. I have 700 pages to look through. So somebody presented on this, okay? So the FDA, the European Food Safety Authority, the Joint European Food, the JEFSCA, Joint European Food Councils, something or other, and the New Zealand and Australia Food Authority. So when it came to the scientific bodies as parts of those organizations who looked through the data, looked through the scientific data, and then came up with their recommendations for the governments of those specific countries, the scientists, the scientific recommendations by all of those unanimously was that there's no link between, they couldn't find any link, causal link between the food colors and these behavioral issues. And they didn't make any recommendations on providing warning labels or banning anything. None of these scientific councils made those recommendations. The EFSA made put the warning labels on the packages for food stores. So these were the politicians who ended up doing it. And there was a response from the scientific body of the EFSA who said, the scientists came out and said, the politicians have recommended this warning label not in light of our findings and our recommendations, but despite our finding and recommendations. So for the CSPI to bring up this thing where the EFSA is putting warning labels on means that they are they're leaving out the portion where the scientific body said, look, we don't find on the basis of the scientific evidence, we don't find enough evidence here to make these recommendations. The politicians are making the recommendations despite our recommendations, right? They have the ability to do that, but those are not our recommendations. So the CSPI is leaving that part out.
Yes, yes, yes. Something else that hit me as well on this is that so for this regulation to go into effect in the UK, the European Union had to vote on it and pass it.
Yeah.
Well, good luck. Good luck getting all these other countries to go along with that, because it was a political decision, not a
Yeah.
scientific decision.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I don't see that. I don't see all the European Union countries going, "Oh yeah, we're in.
Yes. Yeah.
Vote
The
for me."
warning, yeah, the warning label in Europe is a political decision, not a scientific decision.
Yes, 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 yes. And that was the question that associated this was with global governments taking action on these studies and overwhelming data to limit, remove synthetic food dyes from foods. Why won't the U.S. FDA? But I think that's self-explanatory. I think we answered that, right?
Yeah. The other part to that is to say they're kind of implying that the FDA is doing nothing,
Right.
but the amount of testing and safety protocols and regulations and everything else that the FDA has put in place for the current um, food colors that are allowed has been monumental. And there are food colors that are allowed in Europe but are banned in the United States. And there were food colors that were used before that the FDA then banned later on because the evidence led them to the conclusion, hey, these ones are actually harmful. So to make the implication that the FDA is doing nothing, and this was actually a huge question for the committee members when they came to answering these questions at the end of the hearing, at the end of the meeting, I don't know what you call it, is that many of them were answering no to some of these questions, right? Like, is there a reason to put warning labels on? And many of them were saying no. Some of them were saying yes, and they were all making their case back and forth. But the thing that was common amongst all of them, amongst many of these questions, is that the panel didn't want the general public to feel like because they answered no or yes on some of these questions, that nothing has changed. It was
Right.
a really a huge a moral conundrum for these guys to make these decisions, is they didn't really want the public thinking, well, nothing has changed. FDA is not doing anything. They're kind of not evaluating evidence or petitions from private organizations or stuff like
Right.
that. They
Right.
they really had a tough time with that. So to hear that from the CSPI, like I'm not liking this organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Going back to them, actually, that they have I don't want to say outlawed, banned, removed. There are colors that they have removed. I think
Mhm.
one of them was violet, and I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
yeah, I think that was the newest one, because there was like nine. I think there was like nine synthetic colors within the last, like, that they've been used in like the last, say, um 10 years, 15 years or so.
Mhm.
And and I could identify eight of them, but the ninth one was violet, which was taken off of the market. So the only thing that I have left to say here, I really can't. I need to read it. I don't want to read it, but I really need to read it, because this is like the last leg. Well, I've got one thing before that. I was going to say it's like the last leg to CS that they have on this. But I do want to mention this, that Kraft in the UK, by the way, um, and Kraft has eliminated artificial flavors from its Lunchables. I mean, colors. Mars has eliminated some or all of the dyes from Starburst,
Mhm.
Skittles, and M&Ms in the UK. Kellogg's cereals, Pop Tarts, and Fruit Winders in the UK do not have dyes. In the UK, McDonald's vanilla syrup for milkshakes and strawberry syrup, strawberry sauce for sundaes are all, and caramelized sugar. They've removed all the colors from that in the UK. Coca-Cola's orange and lemon Fanta, uh, they have dyes in the US, but not in the UK. And Haribo's Gold Bears, the gummy candies, um, contains dyes in the U.S. but not in the U.K. And finally, it's worth noting, this is what they're saying. It's worth noting that the Whole Food markets and Trader Joe's chains in the United States do not market any foods that contain dyes or other artificial ingredients. I thought that was interesting. But again, it's not, that's based, I really believe that's a political thing.
Artificial dyes. They use natural dyes.
Yeah,
So
they use
all
natural
those,
dyes,
yeah,
but
all those things that you
artificial dyes.
brought to use are they use natural dyes. Yeah.
Yeah. They use natural dyes.
Yeah.
Okay, so this last thing is like the real leg. The document that I did a deep dive on that Coach Lamby sent me, it really works down to this. Let me read this for you, okay? It's all about the FDA. They have ample legal authority to ban the use of yellow 5 and other dyes in food. Section 721B4 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, 21 USC 379E-B4, blah, 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 bars the use of any color additive in food unless the FDA has found that data established such use under the conditions of use specified in the regulations will be safe. Section 721 also authorizes the amendment or repeal of any food color regulation, says the term safe as used in Section 721 has reference to the health of man or animal. The FDA's regulations say that safe means that there is convincing evidence that establishes with reasonable certainty that no harm will result from the intended use of the color additive. Congress has directed the federal court to sustain the FDA's repeal or amendment of food color regulations if the FDA's decision is based upon a fair evaluation of the entire record. A fair evaluation of all scientific evidence discussed above makes it clear that yellow 5 and mixtures of various dyes in food are unsafe within the meaning of the FFDCA and the FDA's own regulations. Instead of there being convincing evidence that the dyes cause no harm, there is convincing evidence that the dyes do cause harm to many children. And so that's what their stance is legally. And when it comes down to, I think the question there is going to be, let's talk about what many children mean and convincing evidence that the dyes cause no harm. So I think you can answer both of those.
Yes. So the many children, so they talked about, so dealing with that, man, I'm trying to find this legality thing on the safe and harm, because there was a big spiel about that. And it, gosh, I can't find it. Can you read that thing where it says the law about the safe and harm thing? I feel like there's a sentence missing out of that.
Yes, stand by. Section 721, and this is copied directly out of the document. So Section 721B4 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FFDCA, 21 USC 379E-B4, bars the use of any color additive in food unless the FDA found that the data, now there's a bunch of dots here, establish that such use under the conditions of use specified in the regulations will be safe. Section 721B5C1 authorizes the amendment or repeal of any food color regulation. Section 201 of the FFDCA says that the term safe as used in Section 721 has reference to the health of man or animal. The FDA's regulations say that safe means that there is convincing evidence that establishes with reasonable certainty that no harm will result from intended use of the color additive. Then it goes on to say, Congress has directed a federal court to sustain the FDA's repeal or amendment of a food color regulation if the FDA's decision is based upon a fair evaluation of the entire record. A fair evaluation of all the scientific evidence discussed above makes it clear that yellow 5 and mixtures of various dyes in food are unsafe within the meaning of the FFDCA and the FDA's own regulations. Instead of there being convincing evidence that the dyes cause no harm, there is convincing evidence that the dyes do cause harm to many children. Did that cover it for you?
Yeah. So there is in the legal term of how they're defining no harm or safe. I can't find it. If I can later on, I will flash it on the screen here for you guys. There's a sentence missing where it qualifies safe and no harm. And it basically means like no harm is not meant to take the assumption that under any circumstances, no amount of harm will occur to anyone. Like that's an impossible standard to meet. That standard isn't applied to any other um, thing that the FDA covers. Uh, so this was brought up. So the CSPI is leaving out a very qualifying sentence, which I find to be shady. Um, oh, biscuits. Let me see. I found this portion of this here. Let me share this on the screen with you. All right. So Dr. Jones here, he's on the FCA or FAC committee, and we have a Dr. Cheeseman, which is an interesting name there. But Dr. Cheeseman is one of the representatives from the FDA. So Dr. Jones here says he's asking, we have two issues here, and this is specifically addressing what you just talked about. So one is assessing the strength of evidence, which he understands, and none of them found it to be that convincing. The second is the standard to which it's applied, and to use the term no harm, unqualified suggests that you can interpret that as ever in anyone, which many would argue is unattainable. And there's sort of this unavoidable issue, and you mentioned this, comparing it to other foods which are accepted. Some may say caffeine or a host of other additives, which people generally don't argue about. So this no harm thing, right, is like, well, that isn't applied to other things like caffeine, right? Which nobody is arguing about. So caffeine certainly does cause some amount of harm to some people, or salt, other things like that. And so he's asking for clarification on that. So Dr. Cheeseman responds and he says, well, no harm is generally applied to the overall population. If there are specific subgroups that require protection, then there are a number of regulatory options the FDA has to address that issue, and that range from labeling to not approving or revoking an existing code or an existing regulation. So I think you would need to address it within the constraints of the general population as a starting point, but you have discretion. So the FDA during this committee hearing is telling the members, the panel, they're asking for clarification on this no harm and safe issue. And he's saying, I think you need to address it from a general population perspective, from a starting point, but the discretion was left up to them. So this notion that the FDA is like violating their own law or something, I think is completely ridiculous, because they told this committee panel, listen, you have full discretion on how to make recommendations to us.
Yeah, I can't find anything anymore on that. I mean, yeah, it was like they're
leaving out a qualifying sentence.
Yeah, they are. And yes, they are. Because you just can't say unequivocally, well, good lands. It's like
no harm doesn't it doesn't mean
so
it does it yeah to take that to its logical conclusion and say, well, like, it can't produce and then to say no harm is a subjective term that I think the CSPI is trying to capitalize on.
Yeah, the verbiage. It's a lawyer move. It's a
Yeah.
lawyer move. Honestly,
Yeah.
nothing against lawyers. But for example, can you drink too much water?
Right.
Yeah. What's that word when you drink too much water, like after a race or something,
Yeah.
and you
Over.
consume too much? Yeah, I forget the word right now. I wish Kathy was here. She'd tell me exactly what the word was. But
Hypernatremia.
Hypernatremia, that's it.
Yeah.
So can you drink too much water? Yeah. So can water be harmful? Yeah. Well, you want to apply that to everything? So that's the part that I think that you're talking about. That's the part that's missing out is you can't, it's not a yes or a no or a plus or a minus or a 0 or a 1. It's like you have to have, look, we have to set some parameters. And yeah, that's when I was telling you, even before the podcast and at the beginning of the podcast, a bulk of this, they're working on a lot of times legal cases are made on, hey, what's your
Mhm.
definition? So what's your definition of this? So
Yeah. Unfortunately for them, this all was clarified during this committee meeting. And the
yes, it
discretion,
was.
full discretion was left to this committee panel,
Yes,
who, by
yes,
the way, were not employed by the FDA. These people who made these decisions were not employed by
right,
the FDA.
right, right, right,
So
right.
there is that. Is that all you got?
That's it, man.
That's it. Okay. Yeah. So my little synopsis reading this these committee meeting notes here over 700 some pages. So I feel like from the scientific standpoint, the evidence just isn't convincing. It's just not strong. Now somebody on the panel made the comment that, like, listen, there may still be something here. Everyone agrees that we need more testing. I agree with the representative from the food color industry that we kind of need some way, a standardized way of doing these tests and a standardized um, outcome that we're looking for to answer specific questions, and we can then design better studies to answer these questions. Um, Gosh, I lost my train of thought there. But somebody, oh, what was I gonna say? Anywho, yeah. So, from a scientific standpoint, the evidence just isn't convincing enough at this point in time to say that it's there. Oh, one of the committee members said, we have to figure out some way to do this because there seems to be, the artificial food coloring and behavioral issues. This just seems to keep popping its head up over the last 30 years. It just hasn't gone away, no matter how much testing we've done or what kind of trial they've done. It keeps popping its head up, which is a valid point. Currently, what we have, we just can't make a determination on that. It just isn't there. The evidence isn't strong. The effect size isn't that strong. The percentage of the population that's affected isn't going to be that much. And I don't think any of that right now, would lead us to believe anything outside the realm of possibility. Is it possible that there are some small percentage of the population who are affected by these things? For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Uh, does that mean we need blanket bans on that basis? I don't think so. Now, hearing your side of this from the CSPI, and then what I heard from them within the meeting here, on the basis of scientific stuff, like I think they just need to give it a rest. They're just not good at science. I don't think they have made a very good case on the basis of scientific evidence for any of this.
Yeah,
And they certainly can't answer questions when they're asked about it on the scientific basis.
right,
What I do agree with them on, however, is, the point to where artificial food colorings aren't giving us any benefit. They don't offer any nutrition or anything like that to the food. And so, I can see making an argument on that basis. And then there was another thing about the increase in the consumption of food dyes over the past years. And then we also do have, acceptable daily intakes. And once you start going over those, there's a possibility of seeing things. And they brought up a couple of specific things, like they sent in a cupcake for specific analysis or for independent analysis, and it came back like 10 times the amount of food dye that's supposed to be into it. And so they made the
right,
case like, and we're talking about, like, if you go to Kroger or Safeway or something and you buy the cupcakes that the bakery has made and it has green frosting on it or something like that, like, you don't know how much food dye is in that. So you
right,
give a
right,
child two of those, plus maybe some popsicles, plus an orange juice that has it, you know what I mean? And you can certainly see how, if people are putting in more than they're supposed to be putting in,
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
certainly see how you could go over the ADI
Right.
within a day. And so I think on that basis, that's a good argument as well. And it
Yeah.
certainly has made me think about some of the things that we buy, because we buy the little cookies and cupcakes and stuff too. And this, the coloring and the frosting on some of those things certainly is very bright.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so there
Yeah. I
are
read the same.
those.
I read very similar things about that too, about what the ADI and compared to what some people do. So like if a kid got one of those popsicle things, it's got like the three colors, the blue, white, and
Mhm.
the red. And you have one of those, and then you down like a 16-ounce Hawaiian punch
Yeah.
and then something else. You're gonna be way, 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 way over the ADI of those colors.
Yeah.
But how often does that happen? I don't know. I don't know. But that would be something to consider.
Yeah. I mean, it depends. I'm sure that there are kids who are just downing all that stuff, and parents make a lot of choices based on convenience.
Right.
And then there are also, so hearing from the representative from the food color industry, you find that there are food colorings in things that you don't realize there are food colorings in. So on the basis that these things don't provide any nutritional benefit to our diets, so in and of themselves, they don't. However, they are put into certain cereals and things that are marketed to kids. These cereals are also fortified with vitamins and minerals that children would otherwise be missing had they not been consuming those cereals. So Fruit Loops, for instance, is one thing. Fruit Loops actually has whole grains in it, and it's also fortified with certain vitamins and minerals. It does have sugar, and you do have to weigh some things here, but children don't tend to eat fruits and vegetables that much, particularly vegetables, and they have a hard time eating certain other foods where they might, be losing nutritional adequacy. So by fortifying cereals and making them appealing to children, that is one of the main reasons how we've been able to um, eliminate a lot of single nutrient deficiency diseases. Beriberi for one, um, a whole host of other things. I can't think of anything right now, but um, fortification of foods is primarily how we've been able to do that. There are a lot of diseases that used to exist that don't exist today, specifically because we fortify foods. So getting a child to eat a food like that has been fortified, where we can put whole grains in it, and the child doesn't know otherwise. If you eliminate that, we may find ourselves back in a position where our children are having single nutrient deficient diseases. Um, they're also used in a lot of natural foods to either enhance or prevent color loss. So a natural food is going to brown over time. And the case was made that consumers generally, when you go to the grocery store, you think a food has a specific look to it. And if that look is slightly off, or maybe it's a lot off, that doesn't necessarily mean that that food is inedible or bad for you, but people won't buy it on the basis of how it looks. So using these food additives, the food coloring, to enhance or preserve the color of that is actually helping to eliminate food waste and food loss. And one thing that people don't think it's in a lot of meat, actually. There are dyes in meat, helps prevent graying while it's sitting there on the shelf. Other things like, oh, you're muted again.
Sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
gray meat. Crazy.
And that meat is not bad for you. It
Yeah,
just doesn't look the way you think it should look.
right.
So yeah, so this petition for the FDA. So during the FDA committee meeting, I felt there was a lot of good back and forth. Both sides made some good arguments. Both sides had bad arguments. Unfortunately, I think a lot of what came from the CSPI in their arguments, or the people who are advocating for either the ban of food coloring or the warning label, um, when it came to the specific issues of like the blinding issues, um, dealing with some of the alternative hypothesis, So there were certain foods that were also brought up too, like milk and wheat and a few other things that these people admitted, like, hey, we know these things cause kind of the same behavioral issues. And
Yeah.
some of those foods are not eliminated in some of the trials that people looked at. And so, when challenged sufficiently on their claims about scientific evidence, basically what they came down to were a bunch of logical fallacies. There was the slippery slope fallacy, which was used quite a bit. There were appeals to emotion, and we heard that out of what you read, right? Like, so the
Right.
European Union is moving to provide warning labels and eliminating these. So why can't we? That's just an appeal to emotion. It's also an appeal to
Right.
authority. That
Right.
decision wasn't based on scientific recommendations or evidence. That's a political decision.
Right.
It was unfortunately a lot of their arguments boiled down to logical fallacies. Um, and I feel like they feel like they really have to present a lot of scientific arguments because they have science in their name, and they just don't do it. I don't feel that they do a very good job of that.
Right.
However, they do raise other valid points, and some of the points that they brought up, again, have caused me to reevaluate some of the things that we may buy in the future. Um,
Right. Right. Me too.
because you don't know, and very well I could be putting Cynthia over the ADI, by purchasing something that, a lot of these regulations are very hard to enforce. How do you enforce, you can only have 2 milligrams of yellow number 5, how do you enforce that? So, yeah, so
Exactly.
there are good arguments. Um, I still don't feel that the science is convinced. I feel even less convinced after reading through this and hearing from the actual scientists who were performing the studies and were involved in this work, and then having them question and then hearing their responses. I feel even less confident in their work. Um,
Right. I didn't even know your part because I didn't read your document, obviously.
yeah.
Probably wouldn't have when you told me it was 700 pages. But even coming out of what I did and looking at the studies that they cited on their own side, I was like, well, that sample size is too small. Or what's the blinding issue here? How'd you solve that? Or how'd you
Hmm.
solve this? It's like I was just from their side. I was like, I don't know how they were really confident in even sending that in. They had a bunch of signatures at the bottom.
Hmm.
All these really, pretty heavy hitters as far as medicine, psychology, etc. But I don't think all those people read everything, or maybe they just wanted to be a part of it. But yeah, I was less convinced after reading their side of it than I was before.
Yeah, I've after hearing what they wrote in some of their documents, and there are a lot of omissions that they have in there, and I
Yeah,
think misrepresentation of some things.
yeah,
This CSPI organization, I'm finding to be a little bit discreditable.
yeah. They're more
So
political, I feel, than scientific.
yeah,
So
yeah. So
yeah,
all right, that's that. Cool, good episode, good talk.
good deal, good deal, good talk, good talk.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's not drag this out. I hope maybe some minds were blown. Hope you guys take something from this. You have more information now than you did before, and you can be thankful that I will read 700 pages worth of documents, so you don't have to.
I won't.
So, but for everybody else who wants to read it, these documents will be available to you in the show notes. And we will see you guys next time. Coach Lamby and Dwayne out.
See ya.